Hey YouTube, I wanted to do a little video on the Lee APP press, their automatic processing press. There's lots of videos on YouTube that show what this press is and what it does, but I hadn't really seen anybody that kind of set one up the way I did. So this video is kind of intended for people that are using a Dillon or similar auto press. And I guess I'll begin sort of my goal with reloading with this setup. I'm more apt to spend money on equipment, but my goal is to kind of keep the cost per round down and also keep the time efficiency fairly good as far as being able to, make quite a few rounds in a short amount of time. So I run a Dillon 1050, and then I found getting the thing to run smoothly, and of course any machine will last longer and stay adjusted properly if you keep everything clean. So processing brass, I'd started out initially with just a vibratory tumbler and either corn cob or walnut, and that bothered me in a couple of ways. First, you get dust everywhere when you try to separate the media, and Dillon makes a really excellent separator that's large and heavy duty, but doesn't have a enclosure. So I got this RCBS one that I'm not all that impressed with its overall strength or capacity, but it does contain the dust. But it seems no matter how much you try to separate the media, you still end up with some bits of corn cob or walnut mixed in with the brass or whatever that didn't get separated, that gets into your press. And then especially with corn cob, some of that media will get in the flash hole of the case, and then when you go to size it, the decapping pin will crush that into the anvil of the primer as it pushes the primer out of the case, and that causes the primer to stick to the decapping pin. And then as the case is drawn out of the sizing die, it pulls the primer back into the primer pocket of the case. Not enough to pull it all the way back in, but enough to cause the machine to jam up. These Dillon dies are excellent about that, in that the decapping pin is spring loaded, so you'll see the decap pin push up as it has a load on it or whatever, as it's pushing the primer out, and then you'll see it snap down, and that does a good job of flinging the primer off the end of the pin most of the time. But then you end up with little bits of media, some of the red rouge stuff, you still have rouge on things. Most of the time that stuff is expensive, so I'd end up buying like blasting media in big bags and using some Brasso or whatever and keeping the cost down that way. It is kind of a messy process. So then I started wet tumbling, and I would have liked a larger capacity wet tumbler, but the Cyclone works pretty well with little stainless steel pins and Dawn dish soap and Lemmy Shine. Makes it really inexpensive. The dust is no longer an issue. I'll use the screens that it came with to separate the pins out there and then dry the cases, and then before I throw them in the loader, I'll use the RCBS separator once they're dry, just to make sure that surface tension didn't stick any of the pins into the case. And then I'd load. And unless you really inspected every case, I found sometimes I could get a pin stuck in a flash hole against the anvil, and of course you'd end up in that case bending or breaking the decap pin on the die. So that was sort of a pain. Every once in a while one will be randomly wedged in there pretty good. So haven't really been a big fan of cleaning primer pockets. I haven't really found it makes any difference in accuracy and reliability, but you do get primer residue on your machine. And again, keeping the machine clean and free of grit, I think, is where you get longer life and just things run smoother. If you haven't run like brand new brass through something like that, you run thousands of pieces through it, and it just runs smoothly and doesn't need cleaned or tuned. It's just Wonderful. So anyway, long story short, I thought it'd be really nice to have a fast and efficient way of decapping brass. So this thing, just brief overview, you have a little tube here that you can fill with cases, or they make a little thing with multiple tubes and a little thing to shake cases around so they hopefully drop in head first. And the little jaws will pull cases one by one into this specialized shell holder that's open on the other end. So as one case is in there and gets deprimed, the next one pushes it out that chute. So I wanted something that would feed faster. Of course I could take all the dies out of that press, and then you end up with dirty brass going through the nice press and all that. So an inexpensive press that's easier to keep clean and so cheap, if it wears out, it's not a big deal to get another one. Made a lot of sense, but I wasn't too hip on filling the tubes thing. So this is mounted on a steel plate. I think it's a 3/16 plate, about 4 by 14. This is about, I just sort of made this out of stuff I had laying around. This is a piece of, I believe, 1.5 inch water pipe I had laying around, about 5 inches long, that I just welded perpendicular there, and I drilled a hole and welded a 1/4-20 nut on there, and then that's just, I didn't have any wing bolts, so I just took a 1/4-20 bolt and jammed it against a wing nut just to make a handy way to tighten that without tools. Let's see. Oh, and then square tubing. That's a 1 inch piece of square tubing. I think it's either 14 gauge or 1/8 wall. I think it's 1/8 wall, actually. About 24 inches long, I think. And then the center of this steel pipe is set, I think, 7.5 inches back from the end of the plate. And then I made mounting holes for the press. These first ones, I think, are centered about 1/2 inch from the end of the plate. You don't want the plate under the press as far as it'll go, because depending on the shape of your bench, because then you won't be able to fit the primer catcher bottle underneath. And then I think cut a 1.5 inch by 4 piece of plate and welded nuts on it, to mount it on the bench. So that's basically that for as far as the steel mount plate goes. Then I 3D printed a piece here. I think it's about 4.5 inches high, just out of TPU, so it's a little bit flexible. So it's like 120 millimeters, and then of course the 1.5 inch round on the outside and 1 inch on the inside, or a little smaller for the squish of the 3D printer. And then I added a little bit larger diameter, a little flange, so it doesn't quite drop all the way into the pipe. So that's sort of the setup I have there. And then if you look at it, let me grab a ruler here. So you end up with the center of that lining up to where the cases feed into this press, ends up being about the same distance as the center of that square tube and where the cases drop out of this Dillon case feeder. And then on the case feeder, I replaced the standard Allen screw with another 1/4-20 bolt there, just so I could dink with it without tools. And then finally I printed in some TPU. These are, they're about 60 millimeters long, I think, and 25 millimeter diameter. And I just set the diameter of the tube for the Dillon case feeder on one side. Just made a hole like 1/3 of the depth of the piece here. And then the other side, I just set to the diameter of the plastic tubes that come with the Lee press, and then I just use the loft feature in Fusion 3D to kind of make it funnel shaped in there. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Let me pause for a minute. I'm too lazy to set up a tripod, and I'll actually just real quick, of course this tube for the case feeder just pulls out of the press like that. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll pause here for just a second. Okay, through the magic of lazy editing and being too lazy to get out a tripod, you can see where I was going with that. I've got a cut down piece of the thinner wall acrylic tube that'll fit into the feeder for the Lee APP press with this adapter, the regular drop tube for the Dillon on the case feeder. And these little plastic pieces, you know, will fit for sizing small bullets or different sizes of cases, and you adjust the height with, let's just on a threaded rod right there, where you can adjust the height for the size case you're doing, and it comes with a variety of different size pieces there, and some without the claws for doing bullet sizing if you're gonna do like cast bullets and size them. So anyway, with that adapted in there, it'll really decap a lot of brass in a hurry. One thing I found, sometimes it'll hang up like that. I not want to center the case quite in the shell plate. Keeping it lubed seems to help, but it doesn't always hit exactly right. So I found if I just bump it like that, usually it'll center. It's going to be finicky now because I'm trying to film it. Yeah. Have to fiddle with that. I think the spring that moves this arm kind of pulls it up more where it really needs to be pulled that way, and tends to get it to hang up. But the bottom line is, with that Dillon case feeder on there, you can crank out just a bin full of brass and have it decapped in a short order. And then I'll go ahead and wet tumble it with pins, and it pretty much keeps most of the primer residue out, or what's in there left is really stuck in there, so it doesn't end up with having primer residue on my press. And then I find pins don't stick in the flash hole when there's not an anvil for them to get wedged in against. So for me, that works pretty well. In the past, I'd purchased some not decapped but cleaned brass, and I had a couple of those ring of primer, which I'd never really had a problem with before. Some of it looked to be like military crimp, maybe Korean War era. And I sort of speculate that it was wet tumbled and then not really dried, or it left some moisture kind of down in the primer and primer pocket, and maybe that contributed to corrosion. But it's a pain when the decap pin pushes the anvil and the end of the primer cup out of the primer pocket and leaves the sides of the primer cup in the primer pocket. And then when that case gets over to the priming station, it can cause a problem. So I think decapping first and then tumbling kind of alleviates that, and it allows me to keep the press nice and clean and just things run smoother and faster. So for me, that Lee APP press, when you couple it with a Dillon case feeder, is really the time efficient way to decap things prior to loading. Whether or not I'll use the I did get a couple of bullet sizing stuff here. The press is set up to where the piece that holds the shell holder can be reversed, so it's on the top of the press, and you can clip a punch in it like a push-through die that you'd use in a single stage press for sizing. And then you can get special size dies that fit into this that'll lock into the bottom of the press and size, you know, like your powder coat bullets or tumble lube bullets really quickly. Again, I'm not sure hand feeding them into the tube, into the press or whatever is really any faster than just feeding them one at a time into a push-through die on here. Or now I have this Star luber, you know, for ones that I don't want to powder coat and can do regular lube on. It's quite a bit faster than the RCBS or the Lyman, since it pushes bullets out the bottom. You don't have to pick out the one that you just did. It works super great unless you're planning on doing gas checks, in which case I'll bust out the Lyman. Anyhow, where was I going with this? Oh, yeah, I don't know that I'll necessarily use it for bullet sizing, but as I was monkeying with this Dillon brass feeder, I think with a little bit of, if I had a bigger 3D printer, I think I could make a platter that sits under this, and I bet I could adapt this case feeder to be a bullet down, or a nose down bullet feeder. In which case that would make this thing just smoking fast for sizing cast bullets. So anyhow, hope that press mount and using your Dillon case feeder gives somebody an idea, or some running, you know, uncleaned brass through my brass feeder, but pulling the platter out and wiping it off and whatever, it, you know, it cleans up really quickly. It's not anything like, you know, getting gunk down into the workings of a press. Anyway, hope that's helpful to somebody.